All right, so Angela Davis, Lectures on Liberation 1. Davis begins her essay or lecture on Douglass's narrative by pointing to the contradiction between the ideal of freedom and the concrete reality so many members of supposedly free societies experience, as true in ancient Greece, as in the U.S. of the Founding Fathers, the U.S. of Frederick Douglass' time, the U.S. of Angela Davis's time, and the U.S. of our time. This contradiction, this antagonism between the ideal realm and the material realm, between societies and ideals, between societies' ideals and their concrete material reality, plays itself out in terms of the antagonism between the free and the unfree. At times, this dimension can seem hidden, other times it's clear. In the relationship between the master and the slave, it's clear, and it's this relationship that Davis sets out to philosophically analyze through Douglass's narrative. Now, when there is a contradiction between an ideal like freedom and a reality, there are two possibilities, and so two differing approaches. One possibility is that there's no inherent problem with the ideal, and all we need to do is work harder to realize it in concrete reality. The second possibility is that there's actually an inherent problem with the very way the ideal, the concept, is being articulated. Maybe there's a way that we talk about freedom that makes it inherently something that only some people can have, and that will inherently exclude other people from having. Something inherently ununiversalizable about it. Think back to the Phaedo, where Socrates articulated a concept of freedom as the mind's freedom from the body, as reason's freedom from emotion. Remember how this notion of freedom made Socrates feel perfectly justified in excluding the women from the room. It then made him feel totally justified in drinking the hemlock poisoning. If freedom is freedom from emotion, then if you want to be free, you should get rid of the emotional people. If freedom is freedom from the body, then if you want to be free, you should get rid of your body. For Descartes, freedom meant freedom from other people's opinions. So he got rid of other people entirely, like he didn't even know if any other people existed anymore. In capitalism, similarly, freedom depends on getting money, and getting money depends on other people, your competitors, not getting money, and so not getting the freedom that comes with it. Look at it this way, the freedom of the capitalist not to have to work, which is important because that's precisely what's going on in the master-slave relationship as well. Anyway, the freedom of the capitalist not to have to work is only possible is if there's another group of people, the proletariat, the working class, who do have to work. And if freedom means not having to work, then once again, this is a freedom that can't be universalized. I mean, someone has to work. In the next reading, we'll see how this plays out in the criminal justice system, where the criminal is the one who loses freedom. After that, we'll turn to an ecological perspective, where it's the earth as such that needs to be excluded from the realm of freedom. And in the final reading, we'll look at an entirely different notion of freedom, one that promises not to require exclusion. Okay, so for now, we're going to look at the master-slave relationship, where the master's freedom is only possible through the slave's loss of freedom. So before we get into it, I want to say a few things about the philosophical tradition that Davis is working in. It's actually the philosophical tradition that I've done most of my work in, namely Hegel. So Hegel was a 19th century German philosopher who, in many ways, was the first person to take really seriously the idea that dualism itself might be a source of problems. He developed a non-dualistic way of thinking he called dialectics. Rather than two parts, as in dualism, there are three. The three parts are the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. The idea is that when two phenomena face off against one another, like mind and body, reason and emotion, capitalist and worker, human and non-human, men and women, master and slave, what we as philosophers should do is not try to figure out which one should win, which one is better, and develop a hierarchy between the two of them, and a plan for how to exclude the worst one, or how to enslave the worst one. That was Plato's vision of philosophy. For Hegel, the idea is that rather what we should do is we should try to seek out a third term that somehow includes them both. That third term he called the synthesis. But dialectics isn't just a way of doing philosophy. For Hegel, it's actually how history works. In any given moment in history, there is a thesis that faces off against an antithesis. And eventually, this tension, this antagonism, gives way to a new situation in which a synthesis arises, a figure or institution that somehow includes both the thesis and the antithesis. We go from a situation of scarcity, where it seems like we need to choose a side, to one of abundance, where the new situation arises that has room for both the thesis and the antithesis. So we didn't read Marx in this course, but he's helpful here. The first line of the Communist Manifesto was, "History is the history of class struggles." And in his vision, in Marx's vision, and he's following Hegel in many ways here, in the capitalist era of world history, the thesis is the capitalist class, and the antithesis is the proletariat. The last line of the Communist Manifesto is, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." The idea was that the capitalist era would end when the proletariat revolted against the capitalists, resulting in the synthesis that takes the form of the classless society, where the thesis of the capitalist class and the antithesis of the proletariat class are both absorbed in a new figure who is neither capitalist nor proletariat, neither this class nor that. That's what happens in the classless society. Now, how that revolution happens and what this classless society looks like is an open question. For the worker cooperative movement that Richard Wolff and Bakunin is certainly in favor of, the story is that the antagonistic thesis-antithesis relationship of the boss and the worker is overcome in the synthesis figure of the worker-owner. The person, so think about it, I mean, if the synthesis is this figure that includes both the thesis and the antithesis, and the thesis is the boss, the owner, and the antithesis is the worker, then the synthesis is the worker-owner in the worker-owned cooperative. So the worker-owner is the person who's equal parts owner and worker. So let's take a moment to think about what that would mean in terms of the political landscape. In many ways, the antagonism between the left and the right in contemporary societies is between those who advocate for the interests of the workers and those who advocate for the interests of the capitalists. In the US, for example, if you look at the website for the platform of the Republican Party, the GOP, you see a lot of language about cutting corporate tax rates or lowering the taxes of the richest members of society, the capitalists. On the Democratic Party's website, on the Democrats Party's website, the Democratic National Convention, you see promises to raise the minimum wage, protect workers' rights, to unionize, and so on. In theory, the capitalists would vote for the Republicans and the workers for the Democrats. And so the antagonism between the buyer and the seller, one wins only if the other loses, that's an antagonism, transforms into the antagonism between the special case of the buyer and seller, of the capitalist, who's the buyer, and the worker, who's the seller. The capitalist buys the labor, the worker sells it. That antagonism then expresses itself in terms of the political antagonism between the left and the right. So you have this scarcity situation at the ballot. Either the Democrats are going to win or the Republicans are going to win. And if you think about that antagonism, that situation of scarcity where only one can win and one's winning means the other loses, as rooted in the antagonism between the boss and the worker, the boss's interests are the boss's class's interests being represented by the Republicans, the Democrats, the working class's interests being represented by the Democrats, then that face-off between the Republicans and the Democrats that we face when we're at the polls, as part of the institution of voting style of democracy, is itself rooted in the antagonism, the situation of scarcity between the worker and the boss, which itself is rooted in the antagonism or the situation of scarcity of the relationship between any buyer and any seller. But if the worker votes for the Democrats and the boss votes for the Republicans, who would the worker owner vote for? In doing away with the antagonism between the worker and the boss and the worker cooperative movement, the worker cooperative movement has the potential to do away with the antagonism between the left and the right. As a final note on dialectics, in a dialectical analysis, it's the antithesis always that gives rise to the synthesis, and so the next moment in history. For Marx, for example, it's noteworthy that the capitalist is not going to usher in the revolution. The proletariat will. Likewise, in the dynamic of the master and the slave that we'll look at with Douglass, it will be the slave that will usher in the synthesis that takes the form of the historical moment that dissolves the master-slave relationship, where there are no masters and no slaves, when everyone is a free citizen. If the troubles we've seen stem from a notion of freedom that is inherently exclusionary, then freedom always acts as a thesis that excludes something as an antithesis. If we're ever to have a fully free world based on a definition of freedom that does not require exclusion, a definition of freedom where everybody truly can be free, it's going to be ushered in somehow through those who occupy the role of the antithesis, through the excluded, the marginalized, the unfree, workers, prisoners, slaves. Those in the marginalized position have a certain clarity. They can see something that those in dominant positions of power are blind to. This is known as standpoint theory, the idea that the oppressor and the oppressor are always looking at themselves and their situation from two different standpoints, and the oppressor has certain inevitable blind spots that the oppressed can see past and through. Epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge, so we can say that the oppressed, according to standpoint theory, has an epistemological privilege over the oppressor. Frederick Douglass could see something that his masters couldn't see. That's one reason why we read him. So, the thesis and antithesis then are not equals, not only in the sense of the political hierarchy wherein the master controls the slave. That hierarchy is what their whole relationship consists in. But further in the sense that the slave, the antithesis, has a unique opportunity to imagine and create the synthesis. From a political standpoint, the hierarchy is one in which the master is on top. The master controls the slave. The slave does not control the master. But from a dialectical, historical standpoint, the slave is on top of the hierarchy. It comes down to the difference between the concept of freedom each is operating with. For the master, freedom is the ability to dominate the slave. Now, if the slave, and this is totally possible, if the slave only aspires to himself become a master, then they'll be operating with the same notion of freedom. Freedom is getting other people to do your work for you. That's true as well from a capitalist standpoint. If the notion of freedom that the capitalist is working with is not having to work, then if the worker dreams, and by the way, not having to work is also a kind of liberation from the body, then if the worker dreams only of not having to work, of himself being a capitalist, if the worker who's being told what to do just dreams of a day when he can be the one telling other people what to do, if the worker only dreams of one day being a capitalist, if that's the only conception of freedom that he can operate with, if he can't imagine a conception of freedom where nobody's free because they get other people to do work for them, everybody's free in a way that doesn't require other people to be free, then the worker is operating with the same notion of freedom as the capitalist again. But it's always possible for the slave and the worker to arrive at another notion of freedom, one that does not require anyone else to be not free. The slave is even better positioned to dream of a concept of freedom other than his oppressors, since while the worker can dream of becoming a boss, because social mobility is, at least in theory, possible for a worker, that dream of upward mobility is not available to the slave. He'll never become a master, it's clear to him. And this limit affords him the possibility of another vision of freedom, not of his being himself a master, but rather one in which there are no masters at all, the truly free society. All right, let's get into Davis's argument. So the United States was founded on an ideal of universal freedom. Remember the opening lines of the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, amongst these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet the country was founded as a slave country. I mean, the founding fathers themselves held slaves. Thomas Jefferson, the principal author of the Declaration of Independence, where we find those beautiful words, had hundreds of slaves. If freedom really is an inalienable rights of human beings, then it's essential to our nature. Essential, we've seen that word before. It's what can't be taken away and have us still be human. Like you can't take away the essential characteristics of a chair and have it still be a chair. You can't take away the freedom from a human and have him still be human. But then, what is a slave? If the essence of being a human being is to be free, then the existence of a slave as an unfree human being is itself a contradiction. The figure of the slave contains within himself the contradiction between the ideal of freedom and the concrete reality. This contradiction was certainly pointed out in the time of the founding fathers of the U.S. Constitution. I think a lot of times people sort of like let the founding fathers of the United States off the hook by saying that, like, well, that's just how people thought that time. But it's just not true. There were plenty of people who believed that slavery was horrible. People asked, I don't get it. How can these supposedly revolutionary humanists, these enlightened people, believe that all humans are created equal, endowed by their creator with inalienable rights amongst these life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, and yet simultaneously support, and in most cases for the founding fathers, engage in the practice of slavery? Well, one really, really important solution was to deny that the slaves were, in fact, human. The psychological theory of cognitive dissonance is really helpful here. The idea here is that it's actually painful to have a contradiction between one's beliefs and one's behavior. Maybe one believes that smoking is bad for one's health, and yet one smokes. Like all animals, we don't like pain. And if the pain is being caused by a contradiction between our beliefs and our actions, we try to overcome that pain by overcoming the contradiction. There's two possibilities. One possibility would be to change the belief, to come to believe, for example, that smoking is actually okay. Perhaps that doing things that are bad for one's health is actually okay. After all, when we all do it, and you could tell yourself, well, there are plenty of things that are bad for our health that we do. And maybe you could even say freedom is all about not being a slave to the body's demands. Maybe you identify as an environmentalist and believe that it's critically important to do everything we can to be good to the environment, and yet you drive a huge SUV. You feel the pain in the form of guilt every time you drive it, or every time you tell someone you're an environmentalist. And maybe you get rid of that pain by telling yourself that it's just one truck, a drop in the bucket, or maybe you remind yourself of all the other stuff you do that's really good for the environment, or maybe you just let yourself off the hook by saying, look, no one's perfect. Alternatively, you could change the behavior to undo the pain as well. You could stop smoking or driving the SUV. In the case of slavery, a popular means of overcoming the pain of the cognitive dissonance of believing in human equality and freedom and owning slaves was to believe that black people, in fact, were not humans at all. And so enslaving them was not, in fact, violating or contradicting the belief in universal human equality any more than farming animals. But this solution took some work, like all solutions to cognitive dissonance. I mean, besides the dark skin, they certainly looked like humans. And so it required the creation of an image of black humans as subhuman, as animals. And of course, if they're animals, they're wild and scary and frightening and need to be domesticated and controlled, maybe even caged, if need be, through the whip. Creating an image of frightening black people was not simply a racist phenomenon. It's an attempt to be consistent, to overcome the pain of cognitive dissonance, of praising freedom while holding slaves. Or maybe what amounts to the same, we could say that the racist project was racist, and the racist project of creating and believing in an image of black humans as subhuman is itself grounded in an attempt to overcome an attempt at cognitive consistency. Davis writes, the white slave owners were determined to mold black people into the image of the subhuman being, which they had contrived in order to justify their actions. A vicious circle emerges in which the slave owner loses all consciousness of himself. So that's really important. That is, to be successful, the slave owner is going to need to forget that he did this, that he made up this image. And so he loses consciousness of himself. This is one reason why the slaveholder, the master, has a blind spot from his standpoint. He can't see something that he's doing. But the slave can see it clearly. So here we have a concrete instance of how standpoint theory works. As we'll see from the film, the documentary 13th, that we're going to be watching 2 sessions from now, the film The Birth of the Nation was essential in beginning this process, not beginning this process, but continuing and really popularizing this notion of this scary black person that we need to be, that the white people need to be protected from. But from the birth of the nation through the ongoing ordeal of white on black police brutality, this vicious circle remains with us today. The master loses consciousness of himself because his action of creating this image of the subhuman slave in order to justify his holding him as a slave is something the master does. But if he knows that he's doing it, then he won't believe it. That is, there's a belief that blacks are subhuman. It's a belief that the slaveholder is himself creating. He's the creator of this belief. He therefore has two choices. Either he can know who he is as a creator of a belief, or he can believe in that belief. His situation of scarcity is that he can't have both. If he knows he created the belief, he won't believe it. If he believes it, he won't know that he himself created it. He can't both be a racist and know himself. He has to choose. This lack of self-consciousness, of knowing himself as the creator of a myth, is endemic to the position of the master. He can't be a master and be self-conscious. Not so for the slave. The slave can be a slave and be conscious of his situation. And it's this self-consciousness that, and we're going to see this, makes him able to usher in the possibility of the synthesis of the master-slave, the masterless, slaveless society. But the overcoming of the master-slave dynamic won't happen on its own. And the slave's epistemic privilege won't be enough. The slave will need to actively, physically resist. That resistance will occur on a number of levels. There'll be physical resistance, for sure. It's going to be necessary. But so must it occur on the level of consciousness. And in Douglas's analysis, these two levels of the journey towards freedom coincide. The master, in order to justify his oppression, creates an image of the slave as an unfree animal, unworthy of freedom. Slavery, in this view, isn't at all oppressive, since it doesn't take anything away the slave otherwise would have. And in any case, it doesn't take anything away the slave can handle. A slave can't handle freedom any more than any non-human animal, if the slave himself is a non-human animal. The master cannot remain a master unless he believes in the non-human status of the slave, but the slave can reject this image and experience himself as being oppressed. As fit for a freedom he is nonetheless being denied. He has the ability to know that he is in fact a human, and that the master is creating a false image of him. In fact, Davis argues that once the slave rejects this image of himself as subhuman, he's already begun the process of transcending his status as a slave. He's then in a contradiction between being a slave and not being a slave. He's both a slave and he's not a slave. How can we articulate that contradiction? Douglas does so in two ways. The first, in the narrative, describes the new consciousness he achieves when he fights Mr. Covery. A kind of courage overtook him not so dissimilar to the courage of the Socrates of the Apology, when the latter opted for freedom without life rather than a life without freedom. The mechanism of control the slave master employs is fundamentally coercive, indirect. That is, direct control involves the physical control of another's body. I grab your hand and make you do something. Indirect control involves control over another's body through the threat of violence, through the fear of punishment. Work the fields or suffer the whip. While a plantation could never function if the master had to employ solely direct control, holding each slave's hand and forcing him to work, it could conceivably exist without any direct control. The mere threat of the whip could, in theory, suffice. Indeed, an actual whip isn't even totally necessary, so long as the slaves are convinced that it exists, and that they believe the master when he threatens them, that he'll use it if they don't perform their work. And yet, and this is crucial, the threat of violence, indirect control, coercion, only works to the extent that the slave values his safety more than he values his freedom. Just as I can't be controlled through the threat of a punishment that means nothing to me, neither can I be controlled through the threat of a punishment that means less to me than not being controlled. So if you tell me to give you $100 or else you're going to take $50 from me, it won't work, because I'd rather take the punishment, give you the $50, than give in to the threat. Since I value $100, what's being asked to give up, more than I value $50. Likewise, if a slave is threatened with the whip, or even death, in an effort to control him, that's only going to work insofar as he values a pain-free existence, or even life, more than he values his freedom not to be controlled, not to be a slave. It was in the fight with Mr. Covey that Douglass realized he cared more for his freedom than his life. Douglass writes, quote, "My long cursed spirit rose, cowardice departed, bold defiance took its place. And I now resolve that, however long I might remain a slave in form, the day pass forever when I could be a slave in fact." In this way of putting things, what it means to say that he is both a slave and not a slave is that he is a slave in form, but not a slave in fact. What does that mean? It's worth remembering Socrates again here, for whom slavery was fundamentally an intra-subjective dynamic, a question of which part of oneself was going to be the master and which the slave. Freedom, for Socrates, meant that the soul would be the master of the body, and slavery was the condition in which the body was the master of the soul. It was the soul's slavery to the body. Freedom thus required that one valued, identified with the soul more than the body. And if freedom requires the slave to no longer be bound by the threats of the master, as was the case now for Douglass vis-a-vis Covey, then in a sense slavery all along was itself an intra-subjective phenomenon, slavery to one's bodies and its demand for life at all costs. Davis's analysis here closely follows Hegel's analysis of the master-slave dialectic in his seminal work, The Phenomenology of Spirit. For Hegel, what actually distinguishes the human from the subhuman is precisely the freedom to turn one's back on one's instinct to survive, to value something higher than life at all costs. The master-slave relationships opens up the possibility, then, for the slave to rise above the subhuman, natural level of non-human animals for whom life is the highest value. And insofar as the slave doesn't rebel against the master, he is, in fact, wherein life is the highest value. In this sense, there is truth in the subhuman nature of the slave, so long as the slave doesn't resist for fear of death. But when the slave does do so, when he engages in a fight to the death, when he decides that he would rather die than live as a slave, there is no longer any possibility of his buying into the image perpetuated by the master of his being subhuman. If what it means to be truly human is to value something more than life as such, and I'm not saying that's what it means to be a human being, but if this is one's line of reasoning, then the slave, when he rebels against all odds, has shattered the image that he's subhuman, both to himself and to his master. He may at that point be a slave in form, but he is no longer a slave in fact. Davis quotes a later text by Douglass. That slave who had the courage to stand up for himself against the overseer, although he might have hard stripes at first, became, while legally a slave, virtually a free man. The master and the slave, we saw, operate with two different notions of freedom. And the slave, in his journey towards liberation, is journeying towards a definition of freedom that does not rely on oppression, a freedom whose benefactor is not free on the condition of someone else's being enchained. The first step towards this different notion of freedom is the recognition that freedom is not, in fact, a given, but rather something to be fought for. Only through the actual act of resistance, when the slave actually risks his own life, does he know he is free, and that the justification for his enslavement, namely that he is subhuman, is false. If the image of the slave is subhuman, resolved for the master the contradiction between his belief that all humans are free and his acceptance of slavery, for the slave, at this point, that contradiction is plain to see. He knows he is not subhuman. He knows he is a human being. And thus he knows the master is contradicting himself. He knows the master is actively creating an image of him as subhuman. And so he knows the master better than the master knows himself. He knows that the master is enslaved to his own ignorance of his own role in creating the image of the slave as subhuman, in order to justify his oppression of him. Like a black American hundreds of years later who stands before a white American who's afraid of him, he knows he poses no threat, and so he knows the white American is actively creating a false image of him. and so he knows the white American better than he knows himself. Indeed, in almost every tragic case of white police officers shooting unarmed black citizens, the defense is the same. They were afraid. There is a historical lineage to that fear, and it begins in many ways with the image propagated of black people as subhuman, an image meant to justify the institution of slavery. The supposedly subhuman Frederick Douglass of the 19th century is the Trayvon Martin of the 21st. And in a slave who rebels against his master, risking in doing so his death, we first see a shattering of that image. It's worth noting here the genius of the nonviolent resistance movements of the 20th century, most prominently employed by Martin Luther King Jr. in the United States and Mahatma Gandhi in India's bid to overthrow British colonial rule. In both cases, the strategy was the same, to attack the false image of the subjugated class as subhuman. So Gandhi and King directed their followers to defy the threats employed to subjugate them, to sit at whites-only lunch counters in Jim Crow, Alabama, and to make salt on the shores of the Indian Ocean. Doing so was extremely dangerous, and many were beaten and killed. So in doing so, they were making clear that they value something more than their lives and safety, which is to say, they're truly human. And thus already, these acts of defiance assaulted the image of them as subhuman that validated their oppression. When they were further directed not to resist the ensuing punishment, even on the pain of death, the image of blacks and colonized Indians as subhuman was completely shattered, and liberation, either in the passage of the civil rights legislation in the United States or in Indian independence from British colonial rule, could not be far behind. The image that whites were civilized and blacks savages, that British subjects were civilized and Indians were savages, could not survive the image of blacks and Indians overcoming their natural instinct to defend themselves against the violence of white supremacy and British colonialism. Recall that Socrates sends the women out of his jail cell in a bid to rid the room of the passions. If a woman were to accept this model of the free subject as free to employ its reason without the interference of its passions, to rise above the passions, then she could prove her freedom, her right to be in the room, by exhibiting her ability to reason dispassionately. Likewise, if what it means to be a free subject is to be able to rise above one's animal instincts for survival, someone can prove their freedom by exhibiting their ability to rise above their instinct for survival, to willingly choose the prospect or even the reality of death, rather than living a life without freedom. The war against an image of the slave as subhuman was a war against ignorance. The path towards liberation was, in that sense, essentially educational, and education plays a fundamental role in Douglass's narrative, of course. The image itself was meant as a salve for the pain of the cognitive dissonance of the master, the pain of contradicting himself, of believing in equality but engaging in hierarchy. Now the slave is subject to that pain, the contradiction between his knowledge that he is human and hence, in his essence, free from his slavery to his life, to his body. And the more educated he becomes, the more he suffers. Douglass writes that he comes to envy not only his fellow slaves who have not achieved this knowledge and the torment that comes with it, but the subhuman animals themselves. All of this was predicted by his master, both that an educated slave would never be able to fully be controlled by his master, and so be no good to his master, and that it would cause the slave suffering, and so be no good to the slave. Quote, "As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come, to torment and sting my soul to unutterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I have often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own." So the contradiction between Douglass's essence to be free and his political condition to be a slave is a kind of alienation. His material political reality is alienated from his essence, and his essence is alien to his material political reality. It will not be enough in Douglass's life to end this contradiction through his own individual emancipation, having fled. Once free, he devoted the rest of his life to combating the institution of slavery as such. Okay, so I look forward to hearing what you come up with in the answer to the questions, and we'll pick up next time with Angela Davis's second lecture on liberation. Bye!